All right, we're going to wrap up this chapter with our last elasticity, price elasticity of supply, or E sub S. And much like our other elasticities, this is telling us, it's giving us a responsiveness, a measure of responsiveness to a change in price. But rather than quantity demanded, it's now quantity supplied. So how are firms and businesses and producers responding to changes in prices? And it looks very similar to the other elasticities we've seen. It's simply the percent change in quantity supplied divided by the percent change in price. Okay, so there it is in words, the formula in words. And so pretty much just like the other ones we've seen, the only thing we're doing now is quantity supplied rather than quantity demanded. So the equation is almost identical. It's just QS instead of QD. And as it turns out, this one is always positive because of the law of supply, right? As price goes up, quantity supplied goes up, and as price goes down, quantity supplied goes down. So that this one will always be positive, and it just like price elasticity of demand, it can take on a value from 0 to infinity, and we can classify the regions the same way, right? So if it's in this region here, greater than 1, the supply is elastic. If it's in this region between 0 and 1, it's inelastic supply. We have unit elastic supply when it's exactly equal to 1. And then at our extreme ends of the spectrum, we have perfectly inelastic. And perfectly elastic. And just like with demand, our extreme ends are vertical, right? So a vertical supply curve when it's perfectly elastic, perfectly inelastic, and a horizontal supply curve when it's perfectly elastic, right? So just like demand, right? So with perfectly elastic supply, the quantity supplied falls to 0 even with the slightest decrease in price, and it's basically a horizontal supply curve at a particular price. With inelastic supply, the quantity supplied is fixed, right? So it's fixed at some QS. No matter what happens to price, the quantity stays the same. So this is, things like auditoriums and sports stadiums and arenas, right? They have a fixed number of seats. It doesn't matter what price they can charge. That's the quantity supplied. Okay, so there you go. And of course, what this means is that as we go from perfectly inelastic to perfectly elastic, the supply curve rotates and gets flatter. Now, as far as the length of time for adjustment, it works pretty much just like with demand. If there's more time to adjust, suppliers can be more flexible. They can be more elastic with longer amounts of time. So what that really means is that the longer the time is for adjustment, the more resources can flow into or out of an industry through expansion or contraction of existing firms. And the longer the time allowed for adjustment, the more entry and exit of firms increases or decreases production in an industry. So again, pretty basically, more time means more flexibility, more elastic. So, we're rotating again to a flatter. As time goes on, we go from the short run to the long run. Our supply curve gets flatter. All right, so to wrap this chapter up, let's think about using price elasticity of supply to assess the effects of rewards of academic performance. So in an interesting study, Roland Fryer of Harvard University gave rewards totaling to more than $6 million to about 40,000 students for different measures of academic performance. And he found very low values of price elasticity of supply for test scores and grades. Okay, so students were not responding very much to these incentives in terms of doing better on test scores and grades. On the other hand, he found that for performances of tasks, such as reading books, the price elasticity of supply was about 0.87. So still relatively inelastic in this region here, between 0 and 1, so in the inelastic region. And so what he concluded was that monetary payments focusing on students' educational tasks were more useful, right? So I guess the grades, rewarding grades, was very close to 0, whereas rewarding tasks was closer to 1, right? So these monetary payments should focus on tasks rather than performance on tests and grades. Pretty interesting. All right, and just returning to this cotton issue in Egypt. So when Egypt's cotton subsidy was in place, the price that farmers received for their cotton was $556 per bale, and they produced over 500,000 bales per year. But then after the removal of the subsidy, the price that they received drops to $426 per bale, and their production drops to 315,000 bales per year. So this would be a good opportunity for an exercise. In fact, why don't you guys use this as your discussion post? I want you to use these numbers to calculate the elasticity of supply for cotton, and post the answer that you got in the discussion forum for this module. Okay, so just to recap everything we talked about in this chapter, we learned how to calculate price elasticity of demand, which of course is the percent change in quantity demanded divided by the percent change in price. We then looked at the relationship between price elasticity of demand and total revenues for a firm, and saw how that when demand is elastic and people are responsive to price changes, price and total revenue move in opposite directions. When demand is inelastic and consumers are not very responsive to price changes, price and total revenue move in the same direction. And when demand is unit elastic, total revenue doesn't change given a price change. Then in section 3, we talked about the determinants of price elasticity demand, which included the availability of substitutes. It included the percentage of a person's budget spent on the good, and it also includes the amount of time allowed for adjustment to a price change. And I also mentioned, too, in addition to that, it also includes whether or not a good is more of a necessity or more of a luxury. In section 4, we looked at 2 other types of elasticity of demand: cross-price elasticity of demand and income elasticity of demand, which we saw there that in those cases, the sign can be positive or negative, and the sign tells us different things about the good. So with cross-price elasticity, it tells us whether it's the goods are substitutes or complements, right? If it's positive, the goods are substitutes. If it's negative, the goods are complements. And then we also saw that with income elasticity, although it's not in the slides, the sign is telling us whether the good is normal or inferior. So when the income elasticity of demand is positive, they're normal, and when it's negative, they're inferior. It's an inferior good. And then in the last section, we classified what supply elasticity is and how the length of time for adjustment can affect that. So, it's very, very similar to demand, elasticity of demand, only we're talking about quantity supplied and the supply side of the model. So thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video lecture.